What's up, guys? You're watching Life at TCG. Earlier in the week, when I recorded my Final Fantasy video, I did say I was going to upload some MTG content as well. I've only just had time to get around to doing that now, so not last weekend, but the weekend before, I played in a medium-sized, maybe 30-something players legacy event, and I won a Tiger. My final place was in the top 4, where I lost. So, of course, my last Legacy video I think was the GP Niagara Falls one. And of course, since then the metagame has changed quite a lot, because both War of the Spark and Modern Horizons 1 were released since then. So that's changed the metagame quite a lot. And I have had some success playing tournaments using Rug Delver. They're quite like an old style version, still with Vryn and 6, but still with 4 Nimble Mongoose and I think only 3 Stifle. And I had quite some decent success with that. Because Red and 6 is a good card, which I'm sure you all know by now, and the deck also got some other toys in the form of like Force of Negation, and playing with Cindervines also, that card did impress me quite a lot. But despite this Tiger, we are not going to be using any red or green cards, or we didn't in that tournament from 2 weeks ago, because what I wanted to find out was how well Death Shadow could survive in this new metagame. So Death Shadow sort of had the reputation as being like a budget deck for quite a while, just like the Delver deck that you would play if you didn't own like all of the dual lands, to play like a quote-unquote real Delver deck. And with the move now into Rug Delver decks with Ren and 6, it seemed like that was even more the case. Like the quote-unquote the real Delver decks were more likely to be playing 3 colors. But at the same time, what I found in the previous format was that the matchup for Shadow against Delver was actually not so bad, or was even slightly favoured for Shadow, simply because when your opponent is only relying on bolts for removal, and all their creatures are things like Dreadful Arcanist and Tarmogoyf and things like that, an enormous Death Shadow can be quite the roadblock, as long as you're careful to play around burn spells. So I just wanted to revisit Death Shadow again in this new format that we're in at the moment, and see how well it could do. So I've been kind of like stalling at the start of the video a bit, because as I've sat down and pulled the deck out of its box, I realised I haven't even sorted it or de-sideboarded it since the end of that tournament, obviously. But so we have the 4 Shadow, obviously, the 4 Street Wraith, pretty mandatory. I'm trying to make this as quick as possible. The mana base, we have the 4 Watery Grave and 2 Underground Sea. This split is I wouldn't exactly say hotly debated, but maybe a little bit unusual. It's relatively common to only see like 5 dual lands, or you play like 3 Watery Grave and 2 Underground Sea is quite common, or like 3 of each is also quite common. But this was the same configuration that I played at Niagara Falls, and I didn't have any problems with it, so I kept it the same. Then we have 8 Fetchlands, and then the 3 Wastelands. And then for the spells, Well, there's still some more creatures obviously because this isn't sorted, so we'll finish that off first. 2 Tombstalker. Again, maybe a little bit suspect. I think a lot of people question the validity of this card quite a lot. I think that there are some matchups, like Elves for example, that have become a lot less popular than they were in the past, due to the existence of things like Plague Engineer and Arena 6. So in those cases the evasion is slightly less useful, and against decks that are trying to recur Wasteland on you, being able to play Angler for only 1 black mana instead of Tombstalker for 2 is quite a relevant upside to having Angler. So I think maybe Tombstalker is slightly worse now, but you know, I still think it's quite close. But of course, if you want to play Angler, that's obviously fine. Don't get hung up on that too much. And then 2 Vryn's Prodigy again. So just like the version I played in Niagara Falls, I still think Shadow works the best without necessarily playing Delver of Secrets. Just in a deck where your threats are way stronger and you don't have those burn spells to help you clean up after pressuring the opponent in the early turns, I think Delver doesn't really make too much sense, and you just want to have more like options that let you trade resources more effectively, and Jace Vryn's Prodigy is exactly that. So now onto the spells. 4 Force of Will, of course, 4 Daze, 4 Brainstorm, 4 Ponder. It's just basically the standard blue deck setup for Legacy, at least a blue Delver deck anyway, even though this isn't a quote-unquote Delver deck, but you still want to leverage the mana efficiency and play a game plan without playing out too many lands. So the cantrip suite and the tempo counter spells are exactly what you want. And then kind of the more flexible slots, well, staple for Shadow, 4 Thoughtseize. There should be a fourth Thoughtseize somewhere. Apparently not. Where did that go? There we go, 4 Thoughtseize. Then 2 Preordain. Basically how you sort of should think about it is you lose the 4 Delvers for the 2 Jace and the 2 Preordain. But I think I've mostly gone over all of this in my previous videos before the GP, when I was sort of tuning the deck. Then the last few cards in the main deck are 3 Hymn to Tourach, one of the main reasons to play the deck. It's still one of the best resource denial cards in the format. 2 Dismember, 1 Fatal Push, 2 Reanimate, and 1 Liliana the Last Hope. So by my calculation I should have the 15 sideboard cards left over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yep. So, and then my loyal fans will, at least the ones who are paying attention, will notice that this is the exact same main deck that I played at GP Niagara Falls. I think the mix of Fetchlands might be slightly different because I was borrowing some for the GP to make sure that I had like a good split of all the different names, but that's the only difference. All the spells and everything else is exactly the same main deck that I played at the GP. So even though the deck, you know, you might think it's a bit outdated, or it should be, after not changing it for so many months, it actually still works pretty fine. Again, the Tombstalkers are maybe a little bit more suspect now because the go wide decks are a lot worse due to Plague Engineer and Reanimate 6, and those were some of the matchups where you really wanted the flying. And the other thing is that due to the metagame moving away from things that are vulnerable to -1/-1 effects, the main deck Liliana is a bit worse. So you could look at replacing that as well. And the other thing is that due to the fact that most of the Delver decks now are rug based, then Angler is much less popular than it was at the time of the GP. I think maybe you could look at playing one Snuff Out in your main deck, or at least somewhere in the 75, perhaps replacing one of the Dismembers, because it's a really good tempo swing against all the 2-drops that it kills, especially Tarmogoyf and Dreadhorde Arcanist, and even versus things like Hex Drinker or just 1-drops like Delver of Secrets, it's still fine. So that would be the other consideration for the main deck, but everything else still works well. Then the sideboard, so still 3 Ratchet Bomb. Now the deck also has Contentious Plan available to it after War of the Spark. Of course, at the Pro Tour, LSV's team became sort of famous for popularizing Throne of Geth as an answer to Chalice of the Void by using Proliferate on it to make it go up to 2. I think that the most popular Chalice deck now is probably the Moon build, rather than like Steel Stompy, which is one of the things that gets hurt a lot by having Chalice on 2, because it counters all of their like Arcbound Ravager and other cards in their deck. But for example, if you put a Chalice on 2, it doesn't really counter anything out of the Moonstompy deck at all. And it's not so great against the white Bomberman decks either. And then of course this build of the deck is playing cards like Hymn to Tourach, Jace, depending on your plan versus different Chalice decks. Some of these tend to get ported out, but even so, it still counters your own Dazes. So in the end I found that it's not that great, and you often use this card to kill things like Blood Moon and Trinisphere, which Proliferate doesn't affect in any way at all. So I'm really happy with the 3 Ratchet Bomb, and I wouldn't change that for another card. Then 2 Force of Negation. So one of the deck's worst matchups in the past was the Chalice decks, especially the ones with Blood Moon as well. So having a 5th and 6th copy of Force of Will against those is a really great asset to have. The same is true for all of the Delver decks, obviously, but because Shadow couldn't play stuff like Sin Divines or Ancient Grudge or like effective removal for non-creature permanents, apart from Ratchet Bomb, I think it's a more significant add for Shadow compared to the other Delver decks. So I like having 2 Force of Negation. Then 1 Infernal Contract is still here. I have like this nice black border one now, but just as a haymaker versus the white control decks against Unbladen Miracles, they're not as popular as they were at Niagara Falls, so you can maybe consider cutting that, but I still like it just as a way to push through those matchups. 2 Surgicals now instead of 3. The 2 Force of Negations kind of replace 1 Surgical and 1 Spell Pierce, but I still like having 2 Surgicals just against graveyard stuff. Then I think 1 Liliana and 1 Darkblast was in the deck for Niagara Falls as well. These cards are still pretty good, I think, but they are a bit worse now because of Ren 6 and because of Plague Engineer. The metagame's shifting away from stuff that's weak to this. I still like having it. The efficiency of this makes it quite good against Death and Taxes, which is still a bit of a rough matchup, I would say, even though it's sort of like floating in and out of playability. And the same thing is kind of true for the Liliana as well, but maybe you have other options for these slots instead now. That's something you can look at as well. Then the last few slots for Niagara Falls, these 5 cards were, if I just jog my memory, it was 1 Dread of Night, 1 Toxic Deluge and 3 Diabolic Edicts. So now instead we have 2 Liliana's Triumph, which is basically just an upgraded Diabolic Edict. You really, like, the famous thing that people say is like sacrificing your own creatures if your opponent has a big lifelinker, like a Gristlebrand or a Batterskull. But in those situations, like, either you just edict away their Gristlebrand or the Batterskull, assuming they can even, like, if your opponent's drawing 7 cards with Gristlebrand, you probably already lose anyway, like, in that situation. And then especially if they have like Gristlebrand plus 1 more creature, so that you can't just like edict away the Gristlebrand, then you're almost certainly dead. Like, it's not even worth thinking about. And then the fact that this doesn't target is so important versus Show and Tell, because they often board in the white ley line against you. And then in random fair decks as well, when you're boarding in the second Liliana, you can just like, you'll have a Liliana and you'll get the bonus and randomly 2-for-1 them. So this card is obviously a really strong upgrade to Diabolic Edict. The only problem with this is that Edicts are generally a bit worse now. The Depths decks are sort of slowing down, and they have a lot of options with Reclaimer, and especially the Hogarth version has a ton of random critters like the Seder Wayfinder and stuff, so it's very hard to actually hit a Marilage with that Edict now. So that makes it a lot worse, but I just think against generic like Delver / True Name / Stoneforge, random stuff like that, just having extra removal is fine, and this is the most generically applicable, so I still think that's okay, but again, you should think about it. And then we have 2 Plague Engineers, basically replacing the Dread of Night and the Toxic Deluge, and then instead of the 3rd Edict we have a Submerge. So I've been really liking Submerge, both against the green decks with Tarmogoyf, / Knight of the Reliquary, and versus Depths. 0 mana, kill your card is obviously very strong. And then Plague Engineer obviously as well. People are very excited about this for Legacy, both against fair decks like Elves that play a lot of small creatures, against stuff like Eldrazi where it's not necessarily going to kill anything. With the static ability, at least it shrinks their attackers, and it also has Death Touch, so it's guaranteed to trade with something. And then also you can port it in versus like Storm, for example, where you would often cut some of your removal and board in, say, Ratchet Bomb, just so you could have a sweeper that dealt with Empty the Warrens. Now you have basically Ratchet Bomb that can attack. So definitely a solid option. So yeah, my tournament itself, I went 2-1 versus Show and Tell, then I went 2-1 versus Bomberman, then 2-1 versus Moonstompy, then I intentionally drew 2 rounds in a row, and then in top 8 I beat Hogarth Depths, and then I lost to 4-color Delver. So 4-color Delver may be slightly better against this version than Rug, because they have access to Decay, and that's quite an important factor to consider when the dedicated Rug decks don't really have good removal for Death Shadow. But it seemed like Rug, pure Rug, I'll say, or whether that's the Mongoose version or the more popular Dreadhorde Arcanist version, Rug definitely seems to be more popular than 4-color right now. And just in general, I think this deck still has a lot of legs. So yeah, I think it's quite an underrated deck choice right now. Whether it's actually better than Rug is another question, which might not be the case. Obviously, having access to Wrenn and 6 and some slightly better sideboard options is a pretty strong draw to playing Rug. But I think that if you tune this deck a bit more, it could have a lot of game versus the meta right now, just because in Delver Mirrors I think Death Shadow itself is such a trump. It's just too hard for basically zoo decks to deal with like a 6/6 or a 7/7 creature, as long as you keep yourself out of lightning bolt range, which is the only tricky thing. And you have to sort of get your threats down before you get waste locked, which is another reason why perhaps a Delver version could be better, and that's what seems to be the most popular, or like the most well accepted version. The Jace version's always been slightly fringe, and people are way more skeptical of it. But yeah, I do think the Delver version has like its own problems. So yeah, this wasn't intended to be like a super revolutionary, you know, look at my insane new ideas video, just to sort of test out the waters of this format with the Jace build of Shadow. One thing that I didn't say, yeah, so test out the waters of this new format with the new version of Shadow. It seems to still have legs. The addition of these new sideboard cards in the form of Plague Engineer and the new Edict seem like, oh, and especially Force of Negation as well, these make a pretty big difference. The other thing that I sort of forgot about, but I realized after I got home, is that Tyrant Scorn is another pretty good card that you can play. That can definitely end up in the mix somewhere, for sure. So I think that if you tune those last few slots in the main deck, like the Liliana and the removal, and maybe you want to tweak that in the sideboard a bit as well, I think you can end up with a deck that's like a real legitimate contender. I am going to the All Of event in Beijing again this year, which is at the beginning of November. So either I'm going to be taking this or another surprise brew that I'm working on, or possibly Rug Delver as well. So those are the three options. You might not hear from me again until then, as I just sort of test a bit and try and work out what's good. But I'll definitely do another video when I come back from that tournament about what I did end up choosing to play and how it all ended up going. So, yep, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, guys. This is Li-Fi TCG signing out.